I'm going to tell you something I've kept buried for most of my life, and I need you to understand that what I'm about to confess will sound impossible. My name doesn't matter anymore, and soon I won't be here to answer questions or defend what I know to be true. I've lived alone in these Alaskan mountains for longer than most people stay married, longer than most friendships survive, longer than memory holds onto the faces of the dead. The isolation wasn't punishment. It was proximity. For decades, I've shared this wilderness with something that shouldn't exist according to your scientists and your rational minds, yet it has been more constant in my life than any human being ever was. They would call it Bigfoot Sasquatch, some cryptid joke for tabloid hunters and hoax documentaries, but I know its real name, the one I gave it in the quiet language that grows between two souls who observe each other across the boundary of species and understanding. I call it the Watcher, and it has been my neighbor, my witness, my confessor, and perhaps the only honest relationship I've ever known. This is my testimony before I leave civilization behind forever, and I'm telling you now because someone needs to know what's out here, what's been watching us, and what we're about to lose. The first time I saw evidence of the Watcher, I was a different man living a different life. Younger, louder, certain the world was mine to carve up and sell by the boardfoot. I worked timber back then, spending weeks in the deep forest where the trees grow so thick the snow falls in curtains and the silence has weight. I thought I knew wilderness, thought I understood what it meant to be alone with nature, but I was just a tourist with a chainsaw, deaf to everything that mattered. The forest tolerated me the way it tolerates all intruders, with patient indifference, waiting for me to leave or die or finally pay attention. I remember the quality of light that day, how it turned the world into a snow globe of white and grey, erasing distance and direction, until I could barely see my own hands. The blizzard came down like a living thing, and I knew I was in trouble, knew I might not make it back to camp before the cold took me. That's when I found the tracks, impossibly large, impossibly deep, pressed into snow that should have been too powdery to hold any shape at all. Each print was the length of my forearm, and they moved with purpose through terrain I could barely navigate, heading deeper into the whiteout as if the storm was nothing at all. But it wasn't the tracks that changed me. It was the feeling that followed, the sensation of being seen by something with intention and intelligence. I've been watched by bears, stalked by wolves, evaluated by every predator. These mountains hold, and this was different. This was observation without hunger, attention without threat, a gaze that felt almost curious, almost sad. I stood in that blizzard, surrounded by white nothing, and I felt the presence as clearly as I've ever felt another person in a room. It didn't hide, didn't retreat, just held its ground, somewhere in the storm, and watched me with what I can only describe as patience. My rational mind tried to supply explanations: hypothermia, oxygen deprivation, the panic that comes with being lost and cold. But my body knew better. Every animal instinct I possessed recognized I was in the presence of something massive and ancient, something that had claimed these mountains long before my ancestors invented axes. I made it back to camp that night, but I left something behind in that whiteout, some certainty about the world and my place in it, and from that moment forward, I understood I was sharing this wilderness with an intelligence I'd never accounted for. In the years that followed, I began to notice the signs everywhere once I learned to look. Patterns in the forest that weren't random, disturbances that carried meaning, evidence of a parallel life unfolding just beyond the edge of human perception. I told no one because there was no language for what I suspected, no framework that wouldn't make me sound like a fool or a lunatic. So I kept my silence and continued my work, but I also began to watch back, to pay attention to the spaces between trees, to listen for sounds that didn't belong to wind or wildlife. The Watcher became a shadow in my peripheral vision, a possibility I carried with me through every season, every solitary mile, every moment when the forest suddenly felt less empty than it should. I didn't know then that this presence would outlast my marriage, my career, my connection to the human world entirely. I didn't know I was being chosen, prepared, invited into a relationship that would eventually consume everything else. But the Watcher knew, I think, even then. It had already decided I was worth the risk, worth the slow revelation that would take decades to unfold. And now, at the end of everything, I finally understand why. I need to take you back to that first winter, that first true encounter, when the veil between myth and reality tore open and left me standing in the wound. It was deep into the logging season, and I'd volunteered to scout a new section of forest that management wanted to clear come spring. The blizzard arrived without the courtesy of warning, the way storms do up here when the mountains decide to remind you who makes the rule. Within an hour, the world had contracted to a sphere of swirling white, no larger than a living room, and I was navigating by instinct through terrain that had erased itself. The cold wasn't just temperature, it was a presence, a crushing force that turned breath to ice and thought to static. I knew I was in serious danger, knew that men died in conditions like these within sight of safety, their frozen bodies found days later with expressions of confused surrender. That knowledge sharpened everything, made me hyper-aware of every sensation, every sound beneath the wind's howl, and that's probably why I noticed when the quality of the storm changed, when something massive moved through the white curtain ahead of me, displacing snow and air with the weight of its passage. The tracks appeared like declarations carved into fresh snow, each one so large and deep that I initially thought they must be some trick of wind and shadow, some optical confusion born of whiteout and fear. But when I knelt beside one, and I remember the shock of scale as I placed my gloved hand inside the depression, I understood I was looking at something that rewrote the possible. The print was humanoid, but enormous, showing 5 distinct toes and a heel strike that suggested bipedal movement, pressed into powder with such force that the bottom was glazed with ice, where the heat of the foot had briefly melted and refrozen the crystals. I followed them for reasons I still don't fully understand, some mixture of scientific curiosity and primal compulsion, watching as they moved with confident purpose through terrain that was killing me by degrees. The stride length was impossible, covering ground in single steps that took me 3 or 4, and the path chosen showed intimate knowledge of the landscape, avoiding hidden ravines and unstable slopes that I couldn't even see through the storm. Whatever made these tracks belonged here in a way I never would, moved through this lethal environment with the ease of something returning home, and that realization carried a weight that went beyond simple discovery into something closer to cosmic humiliation. Then came the moment that still wakes me in the dark, the sensation that remains more vivid than my wedding day, or my wife's last breath, or any supposedly significant human memory I've accumulated. I felt it watching me, not with the hot attention of a predator calculating an attack, but with cool, measured observation, the way a researcher might watch a specimen, the way God might watch a struggling insect. If God had patience and sadness instead of judgment, the presence was immense, close enough that it must have been standing just beyond the limit of visibility, perhaps 20 feet away in the white nothing, perfectly still while I stumbled and gasped and tried to understand what my body already knew. I froze, not from decision, but from instinct older than language, the animal response to being in the presence of something apex, something other. Something that could end me with less effort than thought. But there was no aggression in that attention, no hunger or malice, only a quality of awareness that felt impossibly complex, layered with what I can only describe as curiosity, melancholy, and something almost like recognition. I stood there, and I don't know for how long because time became meaningless, understanding that I was being evaluated, measured, perhaps even pitied by an intelligence that operated on frequencies I'd never imagined existed. When the presence finally withdrew, it didn't leave so much as dissolve back into the storm, and the air changed in a way that told me I was suddenly, absolutely alone again. I made it back to camp by pure luck, or perhaps by design, following a path that seemed almost too clear, too obvious, as if the storm had parted just enough to show me the way home. That night I said nothing to the other men, but I lay in my sleeping bag, understanding that everything I'd believed about the natural world, about isolation, about the hierarchy of consciousness on this planet, had just been revealed as comfortable fiction. The Watcher had chosen to let me see evidence of its existence, had observed me with an intelligence that felt ancient and sorrowful, and in doing so, had extended an invitation I didn't yet know how to accept. I was being initiated into a mystery that predated human civilization, being offered a glimpse behind the curtain of the ordinary world into something vast and hidden and unbearably real. From that night forward, I was changed, marked, chosen for a relationship that would slowly consume every other connection in my life, until only the Watcher remained, patient and constant, waiting at the edge of the known world for me to finally understand what it had been trying to tell me all along. The offerings began appearing 3 weeks after that first encounter, materializing at the boundary where maintained land surrendered to true wilderness, positioned with such precision that I knew immediately they were intentional, deliberate communications from something that understood the concept of thresholds and respected them. The first was a river stone the size of a dinner plate, its surface worn smooth by centuries of water and carved with spiraling patterns that caught the light in ways that seemed to shift and breathe, geometric designs that felt older than language, older than human settlement in these mountains, perhaps older than humans altogether. I crouched beside it in the blue dawn light, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air, and ran my fingers across grooves that had been made with incredible patience and something like reverence. Each line purposeful, each curve containing meaning I couldn't yet translate, but could somehow feel resonating in my chest like distant thunder. There was no utilitarian purpose to this object, no practical function except beauty and communication, and that realization struck me with unexpected force because it meant the Watcher possessed aesthetic sense, conceptual thought, the capacity for symbolic expression that we'd always insisted separated humans from animals. I brought the stone inside and placed it on my kitchen table, where it sat like an ambassador from an impossible nation, and I found myself returning to it throughout the day, studying those spirals, understanding that I'd been given a gift that was also a question. An offering that demanded response, even though I had no idea what response would be appropriate or even possible. The gifts continued through that winter, with increasing frequency and complexity, each one positioned at that same boundary line, as if the Watcher understood property in some fundamental way, understood that crossing uninvited would constitute violation, that communication required consent and distance before it required proximity. I found arrangements of bleached bones, vertebrae and ribs from deer and smaller creatures, positioned in patterns that suggested careful thought, compositions that balanced weight and form with an artist's eye, structures that looked like primitive calendars or star charts or maps to territories I couldn't identify. There were frozen flowers, delicate Arctic blooms that shouldn't have survived the temperature, preserved somehow in clear ice that had been shaped into perfect spheres and left gleaming in the snow like crystalline planets, each one containing beauty suspended in time, mortality held in temporary stasis through method I couldn't begin to explain. I started documenting everything with my old camera, creating a record that I showed no one because I knew how it would sound, knew that these evidences of intelligence and artistry would be dismissed as coincidence or self-delusion or elaborate hoax, but I also knew with absolute certainty that I was witnessing communication from a consciousness that operated according to aesthetic and philosophical principles that paralleled human thought while remaining utterly distinct from it. The Watcher was teaching me a language without words. showing me that intelligence could evolve along entirely different paths and still arrive at the same fundamental impulses: the need to create meaning, to impose order on chaos, to reach across the void of isolation and say, "I am here, I see you, I recognize your existence as significant." What disturbed me most profoundly wasn't the strangeness of the gifts, but their emotional resonance. The way each offering seemed calibrated to evoke specific feelings, as if the watcher was learning my psychology through observation, adapting its communication to account for human sensitivity and human limitation. After particularly difficult days, shifts at the logging site that left me exhausted and morally conflicted about the destruction we were implementing, the offerings would be gentler, more obviously beautiful, arrangements of lichen and stone that suggested comfort, reminders of the forest's resilience and ancient patience. When I was angry or restless, the gifts became more challenging, bones arranged in patterns that looked almost accusatory, configurations that seemed to ask questions about choice and consequence, about what it meant to participate in systems that consumed the very beauty I claimed to value. I began to understand that I wasn't just being observed, but studied, that the Watcher was conducting its own research into human nature, using me as a specimen. And, rather than feeling violated by this realization, I felt something closer to relief, because it meant the relationship was reciprocal, that we were both trying to bridge the impossible distance between radically different forms of consciousness. I started leaving my own offerings in response: hand-carved wooden figures, carefully prepared food, drawings of the surrounding landscape, and though the Watcher never took them, I would find them rearranged the next morning, repositioned in ways that suggested acknowledgement, acceptance, perhaps even appreciation. By the time spring arrived and the snow began its reluctant retreat, I had accumulated dozens of these artifacts, and my cabin had transformed into something between museum and shrine. Every surface covered with evidence of an ongoing dialogue that was reshaping my understanding of consciousness, intelligence, and the spectrum of awareness that existed beyond human arrogance. The other loggers noticed my distraction, commented on my increasing solitude, but I couldn't explain that I was being educated by something that shouldn't exist, tutored in a philosophy that had developed over millennia in the hidden spaces of the wilderness, while humanity convinced itself it was alone in possessing depth of thought. The Watcher was revealing itself slowly, carefully, building trust through these material conversations, preparing me for something larger that I couldn't yet imagine, but could feel approaching like a season change, inevitable and transformative. I had become a student of the impossible, and the curriculum was teaching me that the boundaries I'd accepted as absolute, between human and animal, between primitive and sophisticated, between mythology and reality, were nothing more than comfortable fictions that dissolved under the weight of genuine encounter with otherness that refused to conform to our categories or our expectations about what constituted consciousness worthy of respect. Sarah died on November 7th, 1989, during the first snowfall of the season, as if the world itself had decided to mark her passing with silence and whiteness. And after the funeral, I returned to the cabin with the specific intention of never speaking to another human being again, understanding that language had become a burden I no longer wished to carry, and that isolation was the only honest response to loss this complete. I stopped going to town, stopped answering the radio calls from concerned neighbors, let my beard grow wild and my grief become a physical presence in the small rooms we had shared for 23 years. And during those first terrible weeks, I moved through the space like a ghost haunting the architecture of my own abandoned life, touching objects that still held her warmth, wearing her sweaters, speaking to her absence, as if conversation could resurrect what death had taken. The Watcher's offerings had continued through the years since that first winter, had become so regular that I'd stopped documenting them, had integrated them into the rhythm of my existence, the way you integrate sunrise or seasons. But after Sarah's death, they changed in character and frequency, became more persistent and somehow more tender, as if the creature understood mourning and was attempting to offer condolence through the only language we shared. I began finding gifts placed closer to the cabin itself, no longer at the boundary line, but on the porch steps. Beside the woodpile, once even on the windowsill outside the bedroom, where I lay sleepless through the long Arctic nights. These offerings were different from the earlier artifacts, less abstract, more directly compassionate, bundles of soft moss that could only be described as bedding, carefully preserved berries arranged in patterns that suggested nourishment and care, small carved figures that resembled embracing forms, primitive sculptures of togetherness that spoke to connection, and the enduring nature of bonds that transcend physical presence. I understood that the Watcher had been observing not just me, but us, had witnessed our partnership through years of patient surveillance, had perhaps understood love through watching its expression between two people who had chosen this remote existence together, and now was trying to communicate that it recognized my loss, that even across the vast difference between our species, it could perceive grief and respond with something that resembled empathy. During my darkest nights, when the weight of solitude became physically painful, and I considered various permanent solutions to temporary suffering, I would hear sounds outside the cabin, not threatening but deliberate, careful movements that announced presence without demanding acknowledgement, a vigil being kept by something that had decided I should not be entirely alone. The first time I saw the Watcher during this period, I was standing at the window near midnight, looking out at snow falling through moonlight, and there it was, perhaps 30 yards distant, sitting completely still beneath the towering spruce that marked the northern edge of the clearing, its white fur making it nearly invisible against the winter landscape, except for the darkness of its shape, the suggestion of enormous mass held in absolute quietness. We remained like that for what might have been hours, neither moving, connected through the glass and distance in a moment that felt suspended outside normal time, and I understood that this was intentional presentation, that the creature was allowing itself to be seen, offering its presence as comfort or solidarity, or perhaps simply as reminder that consciousness took many forms and that isolation was different from being truly alone. I felt no fear during that encounter, only a strange gratitude that something was bearing witness to my grief, that my sorrow was being acknowledged by an intelligence that existed outside human judgment or human expectations about appropriate mourning. And when I finally turned away from the window and returned to the cold bed, I slept more deeply than I had since Sarah's death, as if permission had been granted to rest, as if the Watcher had agreed to maintain awareness while I surrendered to necessary darkness. Through that entire winter, the creature maintained this careful attendance, appearing at irregular intervals, always at night, always at a distance that respected my space, while refusing to let me disappear completely into despair. And I began to understand that whatever the Watcher was, it possessed not just intelligence, but conscience, not just awareness, but ethical framework that included responsibility toward other conscious beings, even across species boundaries. The night of direct eye contact came in March of 1990, during a storm so fierce that the cabin shook with each gust and the temperature dropped to 40 below, cold enough that exposed skin would freeze in minutes, and breathing itself became a deliberate act requiring careful management of scarves and controlled inhalation. I had gone outside to secure the woodpile tarp that was tearing loose in the wind, and when I turned back toward the cabin, I found the Watcher standing less than 10 feet away, fully illuminated by the porch light I'd left burning, close enough that I could see the individual strands of its white fur moving in the wind, the massive architecture of its shoulders and chest, the way its breath created clouds of vapor that caught the light like manifestations of spirit leaving body. We stood facing each other in that screaming whiteness, and for the first time, in all the years of peripheral sightings and distant observations, our eyes met directly and held. And what I saw in that gaze destroyed every assumption I'd constructed about consciousness, intelligence, and the hierarchy of souls that humans place themselves atop with such unearned confidence. Those eyes were not animal eyes reflecting simple awareness or base instinct, but portals into something ancient and profound, holding depths of understanding and accumulated sorrow that suggested this creature had witnessed centuries of existence and carried the weight of that witnessing in every moment of its being. What shattered me most completely was recognizing emotion in those eyes that I understood intimately because I was living inside it myself. The specific texture of grief that comes from surviving what you love, the exhaustion of consciousness that continues despite wanting release, the loneliness of being the last witness to beauty that no longer exists except in memory. The watcher was mourning, I realized, had perhaps been mourning for longer than I'd been alive, and its attention to my own grief was not observation from outside, but recognition from within, one devastated consciousness acknowledging another across the supposed barrier of species. I saw intelligence that was not human, but was certainly equal, perhaps superior in its capacity for patience and silence, its ability to exist in stillness, without the human need to control or categorize or diminish what cannot be immediately understood. I saw awareness of its own existence, evidence of self-reflection in the way it held my gaze without aggression or submission, presenting itself as subject rather than object, as another perspective on existence, rather than a specimen of wilderness to be studied or feared. The longer we maintained that connection, the more I felt my own sense of human exceptionalism crumbling, felt the comfortable lie of our species' centrality dissolving into the recognition that consciousness bloomed in forms we'd never honored, that we'd been surrounded by minds and souls we'd categorized as lesser simply because they didn't speak our languages, or build our structures, or destroy with our particular efficient cruelty. In that moment of complete mutual visibility, something passed between us that I still lack adequate language to describe, not quite communication, but deeper than simple recognition, a transfer of understanding that occurred below words, and emerged as sudden terrible knowledge that the Watcher's kind had been observing humanity for millennia, had seen the full arc of our violence and creativity, our capacity for love and our genius for destruction, and had reached conclusions about us that we would find unbearable if we possessed the humility to hear them. I understood that this creature pitied us, pitied our restlessness and our inability to exist peacefully within the world that had created us, pitied our loneliness that came from having separated ourselves from all other forms of consciousness through our insistence on dominion rather than kinship. The weight of that pity was crushing, more devastating than hatred or fear would have been, because it meant we'd been measured by an intelligence we didn't acknowledge and found wanting, found tragic in our squandered potential, found heartbreaking in our determined isolation from the community of conscious life that surrounded us. I felt tears freezing on my face, whether from the cold or from the emotional vertigo of having my entire species' narrative reframed in a single exchange of gazes, and the Watcher's eyes seemed to soften with something that might have been compassion for my personal devastation, even while holding firm to its larger judgment of what humans had become. When it finally turned and walked away, moving with impossible silence despite its massive size, disappearing into the storm as if the blizzard itself had taken physical form and was now returning to elemental origins. I remained standing in that spot until my legs grew numb and my fingers lost sensation, unable to move, because movement would mean returning to human life, to the cabin and its human artifacts, and the entire architecture of civilization that suddenly felt like elaborate self-deception, a stage set we'd constructed to avoid facing our profound disconnection from everything. That the symbols began appearing 3 weeks after the night of eye contact, traced in the snow during the pre-dawn hours when darkness still held the forest, and my sleep remained shallow and broken from dreams I couldn't remember, but that left me gasping and disoriented. I discovered the first set on a morning when fog hung so thick that visibility ended at arm's length, stepping outside to find elaborate patterns drawn in the fresh snowfall just beyond my porch, shapes that were clearly intentional and constructed with purpose, but unlike any language or pictographic system I'd encountered in my decades of living close to the land and studying what indigenous peoples had left behind in their own symbolic vocabularies. These were crude in execution, carved by something without fine motor control, yet hauntingly precise in their meaning once I stopped trying to read them as human communication and instead felt them as emotional transmission, warnings rendered in visual form that bypassed intellectual understanding and struck directly at intuitive recognition. The central image appeared again and again, a rough circle that I understood represented the Earth, surrounded by smaller figures that were unmistakably human in their basic shape, and from these human forms radiated lines that spread across and consumed the circle they surrounded, darkness extending from our species like infection, like the tendrils of some consuming organism that recognized no boundary between itself and what sustained. I spent that entire day studying the symbols, photographing them from multiple angles as the light changed and revealed new dimensions to the scratched patterns, noticing how the watcher had used depth as well as line, pressing certain areas deeper into the snow to create emphasis and shadow, a sophistication of expression that suggested artistic consideration alongside urgent message delivery. Some symbols showed humans as I'd never conceived us, not as individuals, but as a collective mass, a swarm that moved across the landscape, leaving emptiness behind, transforming everything we touched from complexity to simplification, from diversity to monoculture, from living systems to dead resources awaiting exploitation. Other images depicted what I gradually recognized as time sequences, the same location shown in progressive stages, forests becoming stumps, becoming parking lots, rivers flowing clear, then darkening, then drying to cracks. Animals abundant, then scarce, then absent, rendered in visual language so stark that I felt physical nausea recognizing the truth of what was being shown. The watcher wasn't just communicating observations, but making accusations, presenting evidence of crimes that humans had naturalized so completely we no longer registered them as violence, showing me through snow and claw marks what we'd become too civilized to see about ourselves. The most disturbing symbols were the ones showing humans consuming beauty deliberately, not from necessity, but from something darker, figures destroying trees that bore fruit, fouling water they didn't drink, killing animals they didn't eat, violence enacted purely because we could, because our dominion meant freedom to destroy without consequence or even clear purpose beyond demonstrating power. As weeks passed, the symbols grew more complex and more desperate, appearing almost daily now, the watcher's messages evolving from documentation to warning, from observation to prophecy of what our trajectory guaranteed if we remained unchanged in our essential relationship with the living world. I began finding images that showed humans separated from the Earth by an expanding void, our species floating disconnected in space while the planet beneath us died from our removal of ourselves from its community, a loneliness that was simultaneously abandonment and exile, both chosen and inevitable given what we'd become. Other Symbols depicted what I understood as the Watcher's kind, figures larger than humans positioned at the edges of the scenes, always observing, always witnessing, their role apparently to watch and remember what was lost, to serve as consciousness for a world that humans had stopped truly seeing, because seeing would require acknowledging our responsibility for its unmaking. These images of the Watchers appeared increasingly sorrowful, their postures suggesting burden and grief, and I realized the Watcher was showing me not just humanity's crimes, but its own species' tragedy of bearing witness without power to intervene, curse to consciousness without agency, to perfect memory without means of prevention. The latest symbols showed the Watchers themselves fading, becoming transparent in the snow drawings, disappearing from the edges of the world they'd been stationed to observe. And I understood this as warning that even witnesses had limits, that there were thresholds beyond which even remembering became unbearable, that the Watchers' kind might themselves choose extinction rather than continue observing beauty's systematic destruction. Standing before these accusations, rendered in snow and desperate claw work, I felt the full weight of being human in this moment of our species' history, of inheriting collective guilt for devastation I personally hadn't enacted, but that my existence implicitly supported through participation in systems designed for consumption rather than reverence. The Watcher was making me representative of my entire species, and the burden of that representation was crushing, reducing me to tears that fell onto the symbols and froze there, my grief becoming part of the message, human. Sorrow, inadequate response to crimes too vast for individual emotion to address. I began responding with my own symbols, using sticks and stones to create replies in the snow, acknowledgements that I understood, that I witnessed the witnessing, that at least one human received the message, even if I had no solution to offer, no path toward. Redemption that didn't require transformation, too complete for our species to attempt voluntarily. This exchange continued through that spring as snow gradually melted and symbols had to be created in mud and arranged stones. A conversation between species conducted in visual language of warning and grief. The Watcher showing me apocalypse in progress, while I could only offer recognition of truth too terrible to deny, but too overwhelming to address. Two consciousnesses sharing despair across the boundary we'd constructed between human and everything we'd categorized as other. The confessions came not through the symbols alone, but through something far more intimate and unbearable, a sharing that began the night I found myself standing at the forest edge during a late spring storm, lightning illuminating the massive figure that had emerged from between the trees to stand less than 20 feet from where I waited. Both of us drenched and somehow equally desperate for connection that our respective existences had denied us. The Watcher began to move, not toward me but in deliberate gestures that I recognized as communication, hands tracing patterns in the air that my body understood before my mind could translate, and through these movements I received transmissions of meaning that bypassed language entirely and inscribed themselves directly into my nervous system as felt truth rather than intellectual concept. What the creature conveyed was confession in its purest form, acknowledgement of observations too devastating to continue holding in solitary consciousness, and I became repository for accusations against my species that I had no defense against because their truth was absolute and undeniable. The Watcher showed me through gesture and sound that humans were fundamentally different from every other form of consciousness this planet had generated, that we alone possessed the capacity to destroy beauty, not from need or instinct, but from something the creature's kind had no name for, a darkness that chose ruin over preservation even when our own survival demanded otherwise, that we killed what we claimed to love and consumed what sustained us, uniquely capable of apocalypse through intention rather than circumstance. The most devastating confession came through a series of gestures so simple yet so completely damning that I collapsed to my knees in the mud while receiving it. The Watcher's massive hands moving to show humans as the only species that created ugliness deliberately, that took functioning systems and transformed them into waste and poison, not as byproduct but as primary output, that our civilizations were fundamentally designed to convert living complexity into dead simplicity, beauty into commodities, relationship into transaction. Through sounds that ranged from subsonic rumbles to high keening notes that made my bones ache, the creature communicated that its kind had watched humans for thousands of generations, had hoped our consciousness might mature into wisdom, that our capacity for choice might lead us toward integration with the systems that birthed us rather than domination over them. But that hope had died, the Watcher conveyed, died slowly over centuries of observation until only grief remained. Grief that something with such potential for awareness had chosen instead an intelligence divorced from wisdom, knowledge without understanding, power without responsibility, consciousness that served only itself and called that service progress. The confession continued through the storm, the Watcher revealing that humans were considered by its kind to be nature's greatest and most tragic mistake, the only form of life that evolution regretted producing, consciousness that should have generated reverence, but instead birthed entitlement, the one species given capacity for foresight who used that gift to accelerate rather than prevent our own destruction and everything we'd dragged down with us. I tried to respond, to offer some defense or explanation, but found myself unable to form words that wouldn't be lies or excuses, and the Watcher seemed to understand my silence as the only honest response available, the acknowledgement that truth this complete permitted no argument or mitigation. The creature continued, gestures growing more agitated and urgent, conveying that humans were spreading darkness, that our consciousness functioned like disease from the perspective of the living world, consuming and replicating and transforming healthy systems into mirrors of our own emptiness, that we'd built a civilization based on the principle of taking more than we gave, and called that imbalance success, progress, development, destiny. What devastated me most completely was the Watcher's revelation that its kind had tried to communicate with humans before, had attempted to establish relationship with indigenous peoples who seemed to understand reciprocity and respect, but that even those humans eventually disappeared or were consumed by the dominant culture that recognized no limits and honored no boundaries. The Watcher showed me that we were the only species that destroyed sacred places, knowingly, that violated beauty consciously, that we somehow managed to perceive wonder and choose exploitation, to witness miracle and select domination, that we were fundamentally broken in ways that made redemption seem impossible because our brokenness had become our identity and our pride. The final confession struck with the force of physical blow, the Watcher communicating through gestures and earth-shaking vocalizations that humans had one last chance, not because we deserved it, but because the interconnected systems we were destroying couldn't survive our continued assault, that we'd reached the threshold where our choices would determine not just our own extinction, but the collapse of countless other species and ecosystems, that the Watchers themselves were preparing to disappear because bearing witness to beauty's murder had become unbearable, that they would choose to vanish rather than observe the final chapters of our apocalypse. Standing there, receiving these confessions, while storm water ran in rivers down both our forms, I understood that the Watcher wasn't asking for promises or solutions, but simply demanding that at least one human know the truth completely, that our species' crimes be fully acknowledged by someone capable of understanding their magnitude before the witnesses themselves withdrew from a world too broken for consciousness to endure The creature was making me custodian of the most terrible knowledge imaginable, that we were the monsters in this story, that human civilization was the catastrophe, that our extinction might be the greatest gift our species could offer to the earth that had birthed us into being, and that we'd thanked by treating as enemy to conquer rather than community to join. Learning the Watcher's language became my obsession and my penance, the only response I could offer to confessions that had shattered every certainty I'd built my life upon, and I devoted myself to understanding the grammar of gestures and vocalizations with the intensity of someone seeking redemption through comprehension. Alone, the creature's communication system operated through layered meanings that combined movement, sound, duration, and context into transmissions far more sophisticated than human speech, each gesture containing multiple simultaneous meanings that shifted based on subtle variations in execution, and I spent months practicing the basic vocabulary of acknowledgement and question that might allow genuine dialogue rather than one-directional revelation. What I discovered through this apprenticeship into non-human language was that the Watcher's kind had developed communication specifically designed for witnessing, for preserving and transmitting observations across generations. Without the distortion that human language introduced through abstraction and metaphor, their signs rooted in direct experience rather than symbolic representation. They were living libraries, I came to understand, consciousness dedicated to remembering what humans systematically forgot or ignored, and their language reflected that purpose through structures that prioritized accurate transmission of ecological knowledge, relationship patterns, and the consequences of imbalance across timescales that human minds struggled to comprehend. The Watcher had chosen to teach me not because I showed particular aptitude, but because I demonstrated through years of proximity and respect that I might be capable of receiving knowledge without immediately weaponizing or commodifying it, that perhaps one human could learn to communicate without dominating, to receive without taking, to know without destroying. The breakthrough came during a teaching session in late autumn, when the Watcher combined 3 gestures I'd learned separately into a phrase that suddenly illuminated the entire structure of meaning I'd been struggling to grasp. And I understood with devastating clarity that the creature's kind weren't just observers, but custodians of memory, that they existed specifically to bear witness to beauty and loss, so that nothing would disappear unacknowledged, unmourned, unremembered. Their role was fundamentally sacred in a way that made human concepts of religion seem shallow and self-serving. Consciousness devoted entirely to honoring and preserving awareness of the living world's complexity. And they'd watched as humans systematically destroyed what they'd spent millennia learning to see and celebrate and memorialize. Through their gestural poetry, the Watcher showed me through patient repetition that its kind had documented the extinction of countless species, the death of entire ecosystems, the transformation of abundance into scarcity, and they carried these losses as deliberate burden, refusing to let anything vanish without being held in consciousness and grief. This was why our confessions together felt so unbearably heavy, I realized, because the Watcher wasn't just sharing observations, but transferring custody of unbearable knowledge, making me responsible for remembering what my species had systematically chosen to forget or deny, asking me to become witness to our own catastrophic impact in ways that permitted no comfortable distance or abstraction. As my comprehension deepened, the Watcher began sharing more complex transmissions about its kind's purpose and predicament, gestures revealing that they'd maintained their witness role for longer than human civilization had existed, that they'd observed the rise and fall of countless human cultures, and had hoped each time that wisdom might finally take root in our species. But every cycle had ended in collapse, brought on by the same fundamental flaw, human consciousness that prioritized immediate individual gain over long-term collective survival. Intelligence, without the wisdom to recognize that separation from nature was delusion rather than achievement, power without the restraint that made power sustainable or beneficial. The Watchers had documented pattern after pattern of human societies that initially lived in relative balance before discovering some technology or resource extraction method that enabled exponential growth, then chose expansion over equilibrium every single time, growth over health, accumulation over sufficiency, until the systems supporting them collapsed and they disappeared into the earth that reclaimed their monuments and absorbed their mistakes. What made this cycle uniquely devastating now? The Watcher conveyed through gestures heavy with finality was that current human civilization had achieved global reach and technological power sufficient to trigger collapse at planetary scale. That this time, the pattern wouldn't just end one culture, but potentially most complex life. That we'd become catastrophe that transcended local boundaries and threatened the biosphere itself. The most profound teaching came when the Watcher revealed that its kind were preparing to withdraw, not from choice, but from necessity, because consciousness designed for witness couldn't survive in a world where beauty and balance had been replaced by extraction and waste, that bearing such grief without hope for change had become spiritually unsurvivable, even for beings who devoted existence to exactly that burden. Through gestures that combined mourning and release, the creature explained that the Watchers would retreat into the deepest wilderness remaining and enter a kind of collective dormancy, choosing to stop witnessing rather than observe the final unraveling their memories, insisted was inevitable unless humans underwent transformation that seemed impossible, given everything they documented about our nature. This was why the Watcher had broken its kind's traditional silence with me, I finally understood. Not because it believed I could change anything, but because it needed one human to receive and carry the complete truth before the witnesses themselves departed, to know that someone from the species responsible had been forced to see themselves as they were actually seen, not as heroes or victims, but as the catastrophe we'd become. Standing there receiving this devastating knowledge through language my body had learned to speak, I felt the full weight of being chosen to remember what everyone else had the privilege of ignoring, and I understood that the Watcher had given me both gift and curse, awareness that would make continuing to live among humans almost impossible, but that demanded I try anyway. One last attempt at transmission before joining the silence. The urgent encounters began last winter when the Watcher appeared. At my cabin 3 nights in succession, each visit marked by an agitation I'd never witnessed in all our years of careful communion, and I understood immediately that something fundamental had shifted in the unspoken agreement that had governed our relationship. On the first night, the creature gestured with unmistakable insistence toward the forest, repeating the sign for witness combined with ending until I bundled myself against the cold and followed its massive form into the darkness beyond my clearing. What it showed me transformed abstract knowledge into visceral horror. Miles of forest, where I'd once tracked abundant wildlife, now silent and empty. The dens I'd known for decades abandoned. The migration routes barren, absence so profound it felt like walking through a graveyard of relationships rather than just missing animals. The Watcher moved through this dying landscape with gestures that combined mourning and accusation, showing me scat analysis that revealed starvation, marking trees that bore no recent signs, frozen streams where fish populations had collapsed. Each piece of evidence presented with the patience of someone building an irrefutable case that no jury would ever hear. The second night, we traveled higher into terrain I'd avoided for years, and the creature revealed what decades of warming had done to the ancient ice, glaciers that had been monuments to permanence now reduced to fragments of their former majesty, meltwater rivers carrying away millennia in annual floods that grew more violent each season. The Watcher showed me places where its kind had gathered for generations, sacred sites now made inaccessible by changed conditions, and I understood through its gestures that this displacement wasn't just geographical but spiritual, that losing the locations where memory had been maintained and transmitted meant losing connection to purpose that had sustained them across ages. We stood together at the edge of what had been glacier, and the creature made signs I'd learned meant forgetting, combined with drowning, conveying that the land itself was losing its memory as the ice that held climate records and ancient wisdom melted into oceans that rose to swallow human cities, a justice so perfect and terrible it permitted no satisfaction. I wanted to apologize, to somehow separate myself from collective responsibility, but the Watcher had taught me that such individualism was itself part of the problem, the human delusion that we existed separately from our species and its cumulative impact. And I remained silent because there were no words or gestures adequate to the enormity of what we'd done. The third night brought revelation that completed the terrible education the Watcher had been building toward, a teaching that combined all previous lessons into final understanding that left no room for hope or denial, only choice between transformation and extinction. We traveled to a ridge overlooking valleys I'd known since youth, and the creature used the moonlight to show me the spreading patterns of development extraction sites. Roads, clear-cuts, infrastructure-consuming wilderness with geometrical precision that made human intention undeniable. And then it showed me the same view through what I can only describe as layered time, gestures, and expressions that somehow communicated what this landscape had been decades ago, what it was becoming, what it would be within my remaining lifetime if patterns continued unchanged. The vision was prophecy born from documented pattern rather than mysticism, and it showed total transformation from living system to resource colony, from abundance to exhaustion, from relationship to commodity. The future visible in the present for anyone willing to see continuity rather than isolated moments. The Watcher made clear, through gestures heavy with finality, that this was happening everywhere simultaneously, that no wilderness remained untouched by the expanding human footprint, and its kind had nowhere left to retreat except into dormancy that might outlast human civilization, or might simply be extinction disguised as strategic withdrawal. Standing there receiving this desperate transmission, I finally understood that the Watcher's urgency came not from belief that I could prevent catastrophe, but from the witness keeper's fundamental need to ensure that someone knew, that someone from the responsible species had been forced to see completely before the seeing itself became impossible. The creature was transferring custody of unbearable knowledge to the only human who'd proven capable of receiving it, not because transmission would change anything, but because letting everything disappear unacknowledged would be the final and greatest tragedy, consciousness erased without record or mourning. I accepted this burden, the way one accepts sentence from a judge whose verdict is absolutely just. And I understood that my remaining purpose was to carry this testimony to whatever audience might exist, to speak what the Watcher could not, before following the creature into whatever silence awaited those who'd chosen to see. I'm recording this final testimony in my cabin as dawn breaks over mountains that have become more home to me than any human structure ever was. And I can feel the weight of the decision settling into my bones with the cold certainty of approaching winter. The choice already made, though the walking away remains ahead. The Watcher appeared last night for what I believe will be our final meeting in this form, standing at the tree line with posture that communicated both invitation and farewell. And I understood that the creature was offering passage into a way of being that exists outside human time, a dormancy or transcendence that its kind has prepared for the collapse they've witnessed approaching across decades of patient observation. I've spent these final hours committing everything to record, this testimony that will be found or won't be found, that will matter or won't matter, but that discharges my obligation to bear witness, even if no one remains to receive the witnessing. The cabin around me holds 50 years of solitary life, of grief, transformed into attention, of learning to see beyond the human perspective that insists we are central rather than peripheral to the deeper intelligence that moves through wild places. And I'm leaving it all behind because I've finally understood that clinging to human identity in the face of what's coming is just another form of the arrogance that doomed us. What the Watcher has taught me across these decades defies translation into human language because our words are built from assumptions about separation, dominance, and linear time that make it impossible to convey the relational consciousness that governs everything we've dismissed as primitive or lesser. The creature's kind are not animals in the way we've categorized existence, dividing the world into human intelligence and everything else, but rather represent a form of awareness that prioritized witness over manipulation, memory over progress, relationship over extraction, values so foreign to our civilization that we couldn't recognize them as intelligence at all. They've been watching us since we first arrived on this continent, recording our patterns in oral traditions we'll never access, and their conclusion is both simple and devastating. Humans are the only species that destroys beauty intentionally, that damages relationships deliberately, that chooses isolation over connection and calls it advancement. We are not evil in their understanding, but rather trapped in a form of consciousness that mistakes control for safety and accumulation for security, a psychological trap that has metastasized into planetary threat. The Watcher showed me that we still have capacity for different choices, that human consciousness contains seeds of the reverence that might allow us to rejoin the community of life rather than continuing to wage war against it. But that transformation requires grief and humility our civilization has proven structurally incapable of accessing. The symbols the creature has drawn in snow and scratched into bark aren't primitive art, but rather sophisticated. Communication from intelligence that operates through different channels than our abstract language, and decoding them has revealed both warning and invitation that humans face an inflection point disguised as gradual crisis. The spreading darkness in those images represents not just environmental destruction, but the human habit of consuming. Experience without truly seeing it, of moving through the world anesthetized against the relationships that constitute reality, and the Watcher's kind have determined that this disconnection has reached terminal velocity, where collapse becomes inevitable, regardless of last-minute interventions. But within that prophecy exists small opening, possibility that some humans might choose differently, might learn the attentiveness and reciprocity that allows conscious participation in patterns larger than individual survival, and by making that choice, create seeds of different human culture that might germinate in whatever comes after this civilization exhausts itself. The Watcher has been preparing me for this potential, testing whether someone shaped by human limitation could learn to perceive and value what we've spent centuries dismissing, and apparently I've passed some threshold because the invitation has finally been extended to leave humanity behind and join the witnessing that continues regardless of our species' fate. I don't expect anyone finding this testimony to understand or believe, and that indifference is itself part of what the Watcher has been teaching me about the gulf between human consciousness and deeper intelligence that surrounds us unrecognized and unvalued. I'm leaving at dawn to follow the creature into high country where its kind gather during the transition times, and I don't know if that means physical survival in some hidden community or dissolution into the land itself, becoming part of the witnessing through transformation beyond human categories of life and death. What I do know is that staying in human form, in human society, in human ways of being has become impossible for me, not because I judge those who remain, but because I've seen too completely to continue pretending that our current trajectory permits any outcome except devastation of everything I've learned to love. If you're hearing these words, understand that the Watchers remain in the wild places we haven't yet destroyed, that they're offering the same, teaching to anyone willing to learn the patience and humility required to receive it, and that we have perhaps one generation left to choose reverence over ruin before the choice is made for us by systems we can no longer control. I'm walking into the mountains now, following tracks in fresh snow toward whatever redemption exists for someone who learned to see too late to prevent tragedy, but perhaps early enough to witness it with the honor it deserves. What would you sacrifice to truly see the world as it is? Subscribe to witness more testimonies from the edge of the known world.